Salvete discipuli. Today we're going to begin our discussion about the tempus perfectum, the perfect tense, and this is going to be a two-part video. The first video, this video, will discuss mostly the principal parts used when talking about the perfect tense, and our next video will go through exactly how we conjugate and construct the perfect tense. So before we begin, we do have a little bit of vocabulary review. If you need to write these words down, then please do so. Verbs are actions or states of being, and they have number and person. How many and who is doing the action are first, second, and third person. Verbs also have tense, and that is when the action takes place. So far, we know the present, imperfect, and future tenses, and we're going to add to that today and in our next video by learning the perfect tense. When we look at the sentences on the board right now, Marcus was shouting, Marcus used to shout, Marcus kept on shouting, and Marcus often shouted. One of the things that you want to bear in mind and remember is that all of these actions, while they happened in the past, they happened over and over and over again. Marcus was shouting, presumably for a long time. Marcus used to shout fairly often in the past. He kept on shouting, meaning he started shouting and then he kept on and continued doing it. And then Marcus often shouted. When we compare them with sentences from the imperfect tense, Marcus shouted and Marcus has shouted, the perfect tense, on the other hand, implies that it happened only one time in the past. So both of these tenses, the imperfect tense and the perfect tense, are both past tense actions. The difference being how often or how regularly they happened, where the imperfect tense happens often or repeatedly. And then the perfect tense really just happens once, and it's our basic past tense. So to continue comparing the imperfect tense and our new perfect tense, as you can see, they both happened in the past. The imperfect tense is used for that repeated or incomplete action. And we get this idea because the imperfectus means essentially the not perfect tense, so it's not this new perfect tense, and that means that it's not completed. As opposed to the perfect tense, perfectus in the original Latin means that it is in fact completed action, hence why it only happens once. It doesn't need to happen again. And of course, we recognize the imperfect tense by our letters BA, such as our endings bam, bas, bat, bamus, batis, and bant. We do also recognize the imperfect tense by the ERA when we're conjugating, in particular, the verb sum esse in the imperfect tense. It was, I was, you were, he, she, it was, etc. The perfect tense, on the other hand, is recognized by the third principal part of the verb. And so far in level 1, we've only needed to use the first two parts. Now we're going to learn the third so that we can start using our new perfect tense. So what is this third principal part? As we go through a review, in Latin 1, we talked about the fact that there are 4 principal parts to most verbs, and you are responsible for the first 2 in level 1, amo, amare, to love, where the first part, amo, is the first person singular of the present tense. Notice that O ending, and it just means I love. And then amare is that infinitive form recognized by the RE, which we translate as to verb, so amare, to love. And then we have the third principal part, amawi. This is in fact the first person singular of our new verb tense, the perfect tense, and we'll just translate that as a past tense. I loved, only happened once. And finally, we do have a fourth principal part of verbs, amatus, and it's called the perfect passive participle. We'll talk about it more in level 3, and it's really just an adjective, loved. So as we continue on into level 2, just a reminder that you are now going to be responsible for the first 3 principal parts of your verbs so that you can show me that you know how to use this verb to the full extent of what we've discussed so far in level 2. It is incredibly important to remember your 3 principal parts and to memorize these as part of your dictionary entries. While most verbs are going to be like amo, amare, amawi, amatus, to love, where all 4 principal parts can clearly clearly have some sort of relationship to each other. You see the ama base in all of them, and it's pretty easy to recognize that that verb means to love. There are other verbs in Latin, however, that go like this: fero, fere, tuli, latus, to carry. And the third and the fourth principal parts have absolutely no relationship to the first two parts. So if you were reading a text in Latin and all of a sudden it starts using that third principal part because it's a perfect tense verb, you're going to be in trouble if you don't recognize that it actually comes from this verb fero fere. You're going to look up in your dictionary, you're going to start with T's, and you're never going to be able to find that this verb is just the third principal part of your verb fero fere, to bring, to carry, to bear. So as you go forward with your vocab list, please remember that your main duty is not only to remember your vocab words, but now to also remember your third principal parts. Now, as I said before, most verbs don't do what fero, fere, tuli, latus does. There are patterns to our principal parts to make your life a little bit easier. First conjugation verbs primarily will go o, are, awi, atus, such as our primary example, to love. There are a few exceptions to this rule, such as do, dare, dedi, datus, and sto, stare, steti, status. However, by far, first conjugation is very regular, and the vast majority of your words will go o, are, awi, atus. The second conjugation has two separate patterns to it. The first one being o, ere, notice the macron, ewi, and etus, such as gaudeo, gaudere, gaudevi, gaudetus, to be happy. The other pattern that it has is o, ere, with the macron, ui, and itus, where we have this u instead of the ev, such as moneo, monere, monui, monetus, to warn. The third conjugation, on the other hand, discipuli, we're going to have to talk about this a little bit later in the video because there are just too many possibilities to discuss right now. The fourth conjugation, on the other hand, is fairly regular, and it has a very simple pattern, much like the others, o, ire, iwi, itus, where we're just carrying over the I from the fourth conjugation, such as dormio, dormire, dormivi, dormitus, to sleep. While the third conjugation is going to make your life a little bit more difficult when you're memorizing your third principal parts, there are a lot of different ways that we can tell when a verb is using the third principal part in that third conjugation where it doesn't have a macron over its E. And that's going to be primarily by what kind of spelling changes are in that third principal part. And a lot of times it's going to be a U, such as with our second declension words like moneo that used that U ending in the third principal part, monui. The third conjugation will also frequently use a UI in the third principal part, such as pono, ponere, posui, positus, to put or to place. It also frequently changes the letters in the first parts to include an S. Here we have mito, mitera, missi, missus, where these T's get changed to an S in the third principal part. The third conjugation also frequently will change their spelling to an X. For duco, ducere, duxi, this C instead gets changed to an X. Another addition that we can actually see in our example duco, ducere above, as well as lego, legere, is the addition of a macron vowel in the third principal part. Duco, in addition to the X, gets a macron over the U, and lego, legere has the macron over the E that's not present in the first two parts. Another spelling change that we can expect to see in the third conjugation for the third principal part is a reduplication of the stem. Really, all that means is that we're taking the first part of our verb and putting it before the verb again. So we actually have two kus, kukuri, when we have the third principal part of kuro, kurere, kukuri, kursus, to run. And finally, just to make your life superbly difficult, there are some verbs in the third conjugation that just do not change. They have no spelling changes to indicate if a verb is the third principal part. So when we have verbs like ascendo, ascendere, ascendi, the sheer fact that this third principal part looks so much like the first principal part means that we're not going to know if our verb is our new third principal part, i.e. the perfect tense, or if it's using our first principal part and it's in the present tense. So you're going to have to just base your translation on the context if it's one of these strangely odd verbs that don't change in the third principal part. The 6 main irregulars, of course, you know, are very important to know. So let's specifically go over the 4 principal parts of these verbs. First, we have sum esse fui futurus, to be, possum posse possui, to be able, volo vella volui, to wish or to want, nolo nola nolui, to not wish, to not want, eo ira ii or iwi, itus, to go, and then our primary example of the oddity of the third principal part, firo fera tuli latus. One thing to notice for these is that our irregular verbs do frequently choose to use that U ending to indicate the third principal part. Eo ire is a little bit strange because it has 2 different third principal parts. Sometimes you'll see the verb with the V, sometimes you won't see it here with the ii. And then fero fera tuli latus is just a completely different looking word, and it's one that you absolutely need to know and to recognize. So just to summarize how you're going to recognize the third principal part, which we're going to use for our new perfect tense. Do you want to look it up? Absolutely not. As we talked about before, when you have a verb like fero fera tuli latus, if you don't recognize this new third principal part as belonging to your original verb, you're going to have a very difficult time finding the meaning of that word. So as you expected, you're just going to need to memorize it to skippily. And then finally, as you're reading, make sure to look for those spelling changes in the words. And just a quick summary here, you're going to see a lot of V's, a lot of U's, potentially some S's and X's, macrons, or reduplications. And then of course I don't need to mention that there are also some words that just don't change their spelling for the third principal part. So I want you to take these spelling changes and keep them in mind as you look for 11 perfect tense verbs. On the video there are 11 perfect tense verbs. Please pause the video as you try to find all 11. On the board, you're going to see answers for the first 9. Gemu it is our verb gemere, to groan, and you can see that it adds that U ending. Usit has a double I. This is our verb jube o jubere, and instead of a B, it changes to an S, a double S in fact. Fefelit is our verb follow, to deceive, and this one uses a reduplication. Duxit has that X. This is our verb ducere, to lead. So instead of the C, it has the X. Missit again has the double S. This is our verb mito, to send. Audiwit has the V, and this is our verb audire, to hear. Dokuit is our verb dokeo dokere, to teach, and it has the U to indicate the third principal part. And then finally, we have portavit, which is portare, to carry, in the third principal part. And we have habere with that U to indicate the third principal part. There are 2 more on the board that are a little bit harder to recognize. The first one being wenit, which is our verb wenio, and the only difference between the first part or the second part and the third part is that macron. Typically the macrons are a little harder for students to recognize until they start getting used to these new third principal parts. Our last one, the 11th one, is by far the most difficult to spot and to recognize, and that is because it doesn't change at all. This is our verb reprehendere, to blame, to scold, and as you can see, if we just take off that last little chunk, the base reprehend is exactly the same. This is an example of a verb that does not change in the third principal part, and so without context, without a sentence, without a paragraph, without a story, we can't really tell if this verb reprehended is in fact in the perfect tense or if it's just in the present tense. So please be aware that these verbs, the ones that don't change, are by far the most difficult to recognize, and I'll make sure to point those out to you as we go along and read.